is actually being painted? Today's feast, apart from the familiar scene, the visit of the Three Kings is about attention. Have you ever thought of reading today's first reading about Jerusalem, or in the Bible when Jerusalem is mentioned in full of light and grace, to see it as a landscape which is painted by the author of these holy texts who was inspired by God? That's why my selection, my choice of illustration. We often think that the central event of landscape painting is what the painter is doing. That the most important thing is that how the painter pays attention to the landscape. This is true, of course, but only half of the truth. It is easy to overlook that everything is based on the fact that the landscape also pays attention to us. So when the painter goes to the countryside, his experience is that the countryside, what he sees, says something. And the landscape is constantly talking to us. It wants to share something with us, like a non-stop radio broadcast. The landscape, just like the history of salvation, is a constant revelation and inspiration for the painter. The painter picks up the thought, the idea, and he thinks it further. John Constable, the prominent in the first third of the 19th century as a landscape painter, by the way, he was the first English landscape painter because he was the one who raised the landscape as a genre to the level of an independent subject. Before that, it was the most highly esteemed was historical portraits and historical scenes, then portraits, and then, as a third-rate subject, the landscape. So he was a painter who captured the landscapes, the countryside's attention directed at us. He received an idea and he continued it and thought it about as an artist. As George Polk, the world-famous violinist, said when he was interviewed in Desert Island Discs, that the violin is the extension of my hands. The artist is so one, the musician is so one with the instrument. And this is what Constable did. He extended what he heard of the land. And this attitude explains as to why he didn't feel well among his fellow painters at the Royal Academy. He was convinced that his fellow urban painters were blind to the real living character of the English countryside. They were bad listeners. So Constable's work is an example of how important it is to be able to have undivided attention, when nothing interrupts our listening, when we don't waste the energy of our attention on undemanding, shoddy things in today's context, when our attention is not completely dissolved and diluted in the cyberspace. The landscape, just like the revelation of God, demands our full attention. The landscape, just like God, talks to us all the time, talks to our hearts. And when we are listening, regardless if we are painters or just like love beautiful things or art, we realize that we can always live in a beautiful landscape. Actually, we have been living in the beautiful landscape of God's revelation, that we are that beautiful landscape, the extension of God's idea about our life, how He thinks that we should live, how He orders our life. Against the background of the above thoughts, I reflect on the feast of the Epiphany. In fact, Epiphany is the declaration of the divinity of Jesus. This is what the Christmas season is about, which celebrates the Nativity, the image, the incarnation of God among us. And speaking in the language of landscape painting, Epiphany is an awareness of what the landscape, what God's landscape has to say. Since the incarnation, the landscape, salvation history, has had a human voice. His word is calling us without a pause. So, do we see the often mentioned heavenly Jerusalem as this constantly glowing and talking landscape? As we read, this is the most beautiful biblical landscape. Arise, shine out, Jerusalem, for your light has come. The glory of the Lord is rising on you. Although night still covers the earth and darkness the peoples, above you the Lord now rises, and above you His glory appears. The second reading from St. Paul can be read in terms of our ability to listen. When a person can pay full attention to God's revelation, to our divine landscape, the apostles, like all the baptized, can carry this gift. We can all be good listeners to God's word. To quote St. Paul, this mystery that has now been revealed through the Spirit to His holy apostles and prophets was unknown to any man in past generations. Just like before Constable, they were not interested in what the land is saying, what the landscape is really about, what God's gift of gifts, light, is about. And the gospel story of the three wise men can be seen as an example when human attention is not scattered, when our love is not scattered away, but finds the truth, the whole truth. The three kings were not distracted by any external glamour, power, or manipulation. They just wanted to paint the truth. Literally, they were landscape painters, God painters. They captured what they see at the crib with the Holy Family. And they leave the place, just like us as witnesses. And they leave the very center of history to observe and paint our Redeemer, our landscape for others, what He says. And they make this the basis of our dialogue, being shaped by the way God observes, instructs, and shapes us. To paraphrase George Polk's image of the violin in terms of a question, are we right now an extension of God's hand? Are you right now an extension of God's hand? And when you are, how much love can happen with the people with whom you are gifted to live with?